The morning came grey and bitterly cold over the royal fortress of the north, pressing against the heavy iron grates of the kitchen cellar. Down here, beneath the grand halls and the heated corridors of the sovereign court, the dampness clung to the rough stone walls like a second skin. Clara Finch did not measure the passage of the early hours by the tolling of the courtyard bell or the shifting shadows on the floor. She tracked the slow march toward dawn by sitting on a wooden stool beside the unlit hearth, watching the pale plumes of her own breath dissipate in the freezing cellar. She waited for the exact moment the ambient temperature rose, just enough to make her exhalations invisible. That subtle shift in the air was her only clock. It was a quiet survival mechanism, one of many she had adopted over the years. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. The maid pressed a small dollop of rendered tallow into her palm, rubbing the thick grease into the deep callouses and cracked knuckles of her hands. The scent was purely utilitarian, devoid of lavender or rosemary, smelling only of the slaughterhouse and hard labor. She worked the tallow into the skin methodically, pushing it into the raw fissures along her joints. She knew that if the frost bit into those cracks, her knuckles would bleed over the pristine white linen she was expected to carry to the upper floors before midday. Finishing her task, she wiped the excess grease onto the hem of her rough apron. With careful, deliberate movements, the young woman reached beneath the coarse wool collar of her uniform. Her fingers brushed the cold, undeniable weight of a silver ivy leaf locket resting against her collarbone. The metal was impeccably smooth, the veins of the leaf etched with an artisan's precision that did not belong in a scullery. She checked the delicate clasp, ensuring the mechanism remained secure on its thin chain, before tucking the heirloom deeper beneath her heavy dress. It settled against her skin, drawing warmth from her body. They always said an Omega should know her place. Her place was in the shadows of the soot-stained arches, moving quietly between the massive iron pots, the sacks of winter root vegetables, and the stacks of drying firewood. She survived by remaining unseen, by becoming a fixture of the fortress as unremarkable as the brass hinges on the pantry doors. The silver ivy leaf locket was the only piece of her history she had managed to hold on to, a quiet anchor to a past she did not speak of, a danger she kept pressed tightly to her chest. The transition from the lower kitchens to the King's Cellar was a shift not just in elevation, but in climate. By mid-morning, Clara carried a heavy silver tray up the spiraling servant stairs, leaving the freezing dampness behind for the rich, ambient warmth of the upper levels. The royal study smelled of beeswax, burning cedar logs, and the dry parchment of official ledgers. The floorboards here were covered in thick woolen rugs that absorbed the sound of her footsteps completely. Alpha King Alden sat behind a massive oak table, reviewing a stack of border treaties. He did not look up when the door opened. The sovereign occupied the quiet of the room without apology, lacking the nervous impulse lesser men had to fill the void with meaningless conversation. His focus remained entirely on the vellum document spread before him. His posture was perfectly straight, his broad shoulders relaxed, his breathing steady and unhurried under the heavy velvet of his coat. Clara approached the long table with measured, silent steps. Her task was simple: clear the remnants of his morning tea, without disturbing the precise alignment of the royal records. She reached out, her tallow-softened fingers gripping the handle of the porcelain teapot. As she leaned over the polished wood to retrieve the accompanying saucer, the heavy wool of her collar shifted forward. The clasp of her chain, worn down by years of being hidden and adjusted, finally gave way. The silver ivy leaf locket slipped from beneath her dress. It did not clatter onto the floor, but swung down heavily, striking the edge of the silver serving tray with a sharp metallic ping. That single note cut through the absolute quiet of the room like a struck tuning fork. For a fraction of a second, the maid froze. Panic was a luxury she could not afford, but certainty lodged in her chest like a splinter of ice. The locket rested flat against the tray, the intricate silver veins catching the amber light of the roaring hearth fire, making the heirloom look momentarily like it was glowing. She did not gasp. She did not murmur a rushed apology. Instead, her training in absolute invisibility took over. Clara immediately dropped the damp linen cloth she used for wiping spills directly over the heirloom. She snatched up the locket within the folds of the wet fabric, pressing it tight into her palm. She did this to ensure she did not leave greasy or wet handprints on the highly polished oak table, executing the movement with a swift, precise, and entirely silent grace. Alden's hand stopped moving over his ledger. He did not shout for the guards, nor did he demand an explanation. The king slowly raised his head, his dark eyes tracking the movement of her hand as she pulled the bundled linen back against her chest. He had caught a flash of silver, a sudden glint of something meticulously crafted and entirely out of place on a servant carrying dirty teacups. Clara kept her gaze lowered to the edge of the desk, her breath perfectly controlled, her posture rigid. The air in the room seemed to thicken. She waited for the reprimand, for the royal demand to surrender whatever she had just hidden in her apron. Instead, the Alpha King looked at her hands. He noted the rough knuckles glistening faintly with tallow, the damp cloth clutched tightly in her grip, and the rigid stillness of her shoulders. He did not push. He did not cross the physical boundary she was so desperately trying to maintain. Recognizing her small, frantic effort to stay unseen, Alden simply gave a low, quiet hum of acknowledgement. He turned his face away and returned his gaze to the parchment, leaving the silence unbroken. The kitchen maid backed away from the table, her pulse hammering against the metal, hidden inside the wet cloth. She turned and slipped out through the heavy oak door, leaving the warmth of the solar behind. The latch clicked shut, and she carried her quiet survival back down into the cold. The private archive beneath the northern fortress held the ambient temperature of a winter grave. Alden sat alone at the long, scarred oak table, the only light provided by a single tallow candle that cast rigid shadows across the cold stone walls. He was a sovereign who believed that order was the only true defense against ruin, and tonight that order required him to balance the royal ledgers. Before him rested an iron-banded trunk. It had been recovered from the southern mountain pass 3 years ago, brought back alongside the bodies of his royal guard and his younger brother. Alden had not opened it then, not because he lacked the stomach for grief, but because a king could not afford the indulgence of mourning when his borders were burning. Now, with the winter audit demanding a strict accounting of all royal property, the law required every remaining piece of evidence from that ambush to be formally catalogued. He moved his hands over the rusted iron clasps, feeling the abrasive bite of oxidized metal against his calloused skin. The lid was secured with a heavy drop of royal beeswax, stamped with the wolfenpine seal of his late brother. Eric had always been meticulous about his dispatches, trusting physical seals over spoken promises. Alden pressed his thumb against the brittle wax. It snapped with a dry, hollow sound that echoed sharply in the silent room, a tiny fracture that felt violently loud in the stillness. He gripped the iron handles and lifted the heavy lid, expecting the familiar, stale scent of camphor or forgotten parchment. Instead, the smell of mountain pine and dried copper immediately filled his lungs. It was the undeniable scent of the high pass, preserved perfectly within the airtight wood, smelling of crushed needles and the blood of dying men. Alden did not turn his face away. He simply let the scent settle into his memory, grounding himself in the physical reality of the loss before he reached inside. He carefully dismantled the layers of Eric's final journey, treating each item with the precise respect owed to a fallen soldier. He removed a folded wool cloak, its hem rigid and black with old stains. He catalogued a broken compass, its brass casing dented and its glass shattered into fine silver dust. Beneath them, tucked into the darkest corner of the wooden chest, lay the item the king had come to log. He reached down and withdrew a scarred leather wallet. The material was severely weathered, the dark hide cracked along the seams from exposure to the freezing rain of the southern territories. Alden held it up to the candlelight, turning it slowly in his hands. The leather still carried faint, dark smears across the grain, a final testament to how closely Eric had held this to his ribs. It was not a coin purse, nor a standard military pouch meant for rations. It was the personal traveling wallet of a royal envoy, designed with heavy stitching to carry only the most critical diplomatic secrets. Alden set the battered object on the oak table, his knuckles pale against the dark wood. He took a slow, measured breath, letting the absolute silence of the archive room press against his shoulders before he unfastened the weathered iron buckle. The interior of the scarred leather wallet was surprisingly empty, yielding neither the expected deployment maps nor any final letters addressed to the crown. Alden ran his fingertips along the inner pockets, his brow furrowing in quiet, analytical calculation. Eric had sacrificed his entire convoy for whatever he had been carrying that night. A royal prince would not have laid down his life and the lives of 20 elite guards for an empty pouch. Alden pressed his thumb against the stiff back panel of the wallet, applying firm pressure across the surface. He felt a rigid, unnatural stiffness beneath the dark fabric, entirely inconsistent with the flexibility of cured leather. He tilted the object toward the flickering candlelight and found a deliberate, jagged tear in the blue silk lining. Someone had hastily shoved a flat item into the hidden backing, tearing the delicate threads in their desperate rush. Using the flat edge of a silver letter opener, Alden carefully widened the tear, preserving the evidence. He reached inside the dark lining and pulled out a single, tightly folded square of heavy vellum. It was not a letter of surrender or a hastily scribbled military warning. As he unfolded the thick parchment, a faint dusting of dry charcoal transferred to the ridges of his fingertips. It was a charcoal registry portrait. Alden stared down at the meticulously drawn image, the candlelight illuminating the precise, measured strokes of an imperial archivist. The portrait did not depict a tactical fortress or a territorial map. It showed a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, staring forward with a quiet, hyper-vigilant posture that spoke of early trauma. Her collar was drawn high against her neck, but the artist had intentionally shaded the hollow of her throat to document a specific, undeniable identifying mark. 3 faint freckles sat in a perfect, distinct triangle on her right collarbone. Resting just below them, drawn with absolute mechanical precision, was a silver ivy leaf locket. Alden stopped breathing. The air in the archive room seemed to freeze into solid ice, his lungs refusing to draw in the cold draft. He stared at the shape of the locket on the heavy vellum, analyzing the exact curvature of the intertwined ivy vines and the hidden mechanical clasp rendered in dark charcoal. He had seen that identical clasp less than 10 hours ago. The image flashed perfectly in his mind, triggered by the undeniable physical proof before him. He saw the metal hit the stone floor of his solar. He saw the quiet, invisible kitchen maid scramble to her knees, her rough, calloused hands desperate to hide the silver heirloom beneath her coarse woolen apron. He looked back at the face in the official portrait. Alden mentally stripped away the years of childhood softness, replacing the round cheeks with the sharp, exhausted angles of the woman who scrubbed his hearths in silence. The 3 faint freckles on the collarbone matched exactly. The intricate design of the locket matched exactly. This was not a random orphan his brother had taken pity on during a border skirmish. This portrait was an official imperial document, complete with a faded sovereign wax seal at the bottom corner, meant to verify a highborn lineage. Eric had not been ambushed by simple mountain bandits looking for coin. He had been intercepted and slaughtered because he was smuggling the lost southern heir out of the burning Valen province. Alden let the heavy vellum rest gently on the oak table. The sovereign king of the north did not speak, did not pace the room, and did not call for his armed guards. He simply sat in the freezing silence of the archive, his hands resting flat against the wood, letting the undeniable weight of the physical evidence restructure the entire political reality of his kingdom. The lower administrative annex smelled of dried rosemary and the damp chill of foundation stone. It was a purely functional space, lined with wooden pigeonholes holding decades of supply records. When Alpha King Alden stepped over the threshold, his dark velvet cloak brushing the floorboards, the head steward nearly knocked over a bottle of black ink in his haste to stand. The sovereign motioned with an unhurried gesture, instructing the older man to remain seated. Alden did not ask about the kitchen staff directly. He understood the architecture of suspicion too well to draw a straight line to the quiet maid who had dropped a silver, ivy-leaf locket in his solar. Instead, he asked for the projected winter salt allocations. The request was entirely plausible for a ruler who managed his territory through meticulous logistics. The steward, a pragmatic man with cracked knuckles, immediately produced the quartermaster reports. Flipping through the pages, the older man began a familiar litany of domestic complaints. Southern merchant routes were delayed, meaning rock salt was heavily rationed. Soap shipments had been cut entirely. The steward muttered that the laundry girls were ruining their hands on the rough winter linens. Alden occupied the silence the way a stone absorbs cold. The bitter irony settled in his chest. The steward was irritated over the damaged hands of the scullery workers, entirely unaware that the most invisible girl among them carried the bloodline to command the very trade routes he was complaining about. The sovereign let him talk, until the topic naturally shifted to retaining labor during the harshest months. Using the lull, the king asked a quiet question about the hiring patterns during the winter of the border skirmishes 12 years ago. He framed it as a historical comparison. Eager to prove his institutional memory, the steward unlocked a lower iron grate and retrieved a brittle volume bound in cracked calfskin. He dropped it onto the desk, sending a small cloud of dry parchment dust into the dim light. Alden turned the large book toward himself. The pages were stiff, the ink faded to the color of dried rust. He ran his thumb down the columns of names, scanning the chaotic weeks of the late autumn purge. He found the entry on the third page of the deep winter block. There was no surname recorded, just a single line noting the arrival of a female child, given an apron, and assigned to the lowest kitchen tier. He tapped the line casually, asking about the influx of orphans during that specific cycle. The steward waved a dismissive hand, noting that most refugees from that year had died of the cold. The ones who stayed survived by scrubbing floors before the rest of the keep even woke. Alden let that knowledge settle into him like cold water into stone. Slow, thorough, he closed the heavy book, the dry snap of the parchment sealing the timeline. The heavy oak door of the king's private study closed a quarter of an hour later with a definitive thud, warmed by a steady hearth fire smelling of dry pine. The chill in Alden's blood still remained. He walked directly to his massive desk, where Prince Eric's scarred leather wallet rested. Beside the ruined travelling case lay the charcoal registry portrait on heavy vellum. He pulled down 3 massive, velvet-bound volumes detailing the historical treaties and sovereign bloodlines of the southern territories. He carried the heavy texts to the desk, clearing away his current diplomatic correspondence. Alden opened the primary volume to the records of the Vallon province. The official imperial seal was stamped at the top of the parchment, a rising falcon, clutching a meticulously detailed sprig of ivy. He looked down at the charcoal portrait his brother had kept hidden behind the torn silk lining of his wallet. In the bottom corner of the sketch, faint but deliberate, was the exact same ivy sprig, drawn with the precise proportions of a sovereign watermark. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him, mapping the dates with the steady strokes of a man building a legal defense. The Vallon Purge, a brutal coup led by ambitious regents, had commenced on the second day of the fading moon. Alden wrote the date of the coup on the left. On the right, he recorded the date his brother's diplomatic convoy had been dispatched. Prince Eric had been sent south to establish a trade route, but the historical maps showed his path had deviated sharply toward the southern mountain pass, the only concealed exit from the burning province. The king wrote down the date of the ambush, the 4th day of the deep frost. The official report stated Eric's guard had been wiped out by opportunistic border bandits. Alden looked at the date he had just memorized from the steward's ledger. The quiet maid had arrived at the fortress exactly 14 days after the blood soaked into the snow at the mountain pass. It was the exact mathematical duration it would take a child, traveling entirely on foot through punishing winter storms, to cross the distance from the ambush site to the northern kitchen doors. Eric had not been caught in a random skirmish. He had diverted his entire royal convoy to intercept the fleeing Valen heir, using his own men as a physical shield to buy her the time she needed to disappear into the mountains. The realization lodged itself between Alden's ribs like a sliver of cold glass. He did not break anything, or curse the men who had orchestrated the coup. He simply placed his large hand flat over the scarred leather of his brother's wallet. The quiet, hyper-vigilant girl, who spent her days pressing her back against the kitchen walls, was the sovereign ruler his brother had bled to save. The silence of the study was absolute, as the king accepted the colossal weight of the debt he was now bound by law and blood to repay. The summons arrived mid-morning, interrupting the heavy, wet rhythm of the boiling vats. Clara Finch did not ask questions when the royal guard appeared at the arched doorway of the lower kitchens. She simply dried her hands, smoothed the front of her coarse wool dress, and followed him up the spiraling stone stairs. The transition from the stifling, humid heat of the service cellars to the king's private study was jarring. The air in the upper levels smelled of melting beeswax, old parchment, and the sharp, clean bite of a northern winter draught slipping through the tall glass windows. Alden Vane sat behind a massive oak desk, surrounded by stacks of official ledgers, wax-sealed correspondence, and maps of the northern territories. He did not look up immediately when she entered. The sovereign occupied the quiet of the room with absolute authority, letting the silence stretch until the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind the departing guard. Clara curtsied deeply, keeping her gaze fixed on the polished floorboards. Her hands were raw from the morning's lie, the skin across her knuckles cracked and red. She carefully tucked them deep into the pockets of her heavy linen apron, hiding the evidence of her labor from the monarch's view. She expected a reprimand. She had accidentally dropped her silver ivy leaf locket in his Cellar the previous day, a careless mistake that could easily be construed as a servant overstepping boundaries or attempting to steal precious metals from the royal chambers. Instead, the king opened a wide, leather-bound registry, the spine cracking softly in the quiet room. "I've been reviewing the steward's winter provisions," Alden said. His voice was a low, measured drawl that carried no malice, only the steady, unyielding pressure of inquiry. "There is a discrepancy in the rendering salt. The logs claim we have 40 barrels in the lower cellars, yet the requisition forms from the kitchens suggest your staff is working with less than half that amount." Clara blinked, her hypervigilance immediately shifting gears. She was not being accused of theft, she was being audited. She kept her chin lowered, speaking to the edge of the desk with the flat, emotionless tone of a subordinate. "The steward's logs account for the gross weight of the delivery, Your Majesty. But the salt from the eastern mines arrived damp this autumn. When it dries in the cellar bins, it loses nearly a third of its volume. We have 26 usable barrels." Alden slowly turned a page of the massive book. He did not write the number down, nor did he check her mathematics. And the lie for the laundry vats. The requisition demands a sudden budget increase. The recent shipments of ash were cut with cheap sawdust, she answered evenly. Her mind working through the ledgers, she calculated every night in her cot, simply to keep the domestic machinery running. It takes twice as much ash to render the same potency of soap. The kitchen master has been ordering extra to compensate, though he has not updated the formal registry to reflect the poor quality of the supplier. The king finally lifted his head. The tension in the room coalesced into a physical weight, thick and undeniable. Clara realized, with a sudden splinter of cold certainty, that he did not care about the salt. He was not looking at the financial ledger. His dark, observant eyes were tracing the structure of her jaw, the line of her brow, the deliberate, educated precision of her vocabulary. He was comparing the adult woman standing in a servant's apron to a memory he held entirely private. He was holding the fate of a kingdom in his mind, while forcing her to speak of laundry soap, simply to listen to the cadence of her voice. Alden closed the inventory book. The heavy thud of the leather cover echoed off the cold stone walls, signaling the end of the pretense. He reached into the top drawer of his desk and withdrew a scarred leather wallet. The scent of the room shifted immediately. Beneath the pleasant aroma of beeswax and old paper, Clara detected the faint metallic odor of dried copper and ancient pine, the distinct smell of a violent history preserved in dark, hidden corners. She did not recognize the object, but her survival instincts flared violently. She assumed it was a stolen purse found in the servant quarters, a pretext to drag her down into the holding cells. She pressed her raw fingers harder into the rough fabric of her apron pockets, preparing the quiet, logical defense of her innocence. She would not beg. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. The king's movements were excruciatingly deliberate. He unfolded the cracked leather of his late brother's traveling wallet, smoothing the material with his large hands. From a hidden silk compartment, he extracted a square of heavy, cream-colored vellum. He did not speak a single word of accusation. He simply placed his palm flat against the paper and slid it slowly across the polished oak, turning it so it faced her directly. "I am not concerned with the salt inventory," the man said quietly, tapping a single finger against the edge of the desk. "Look at this." Clara hesitated, then stepped closer to the edge of the wood, allowing her eyes to drop to the document. The drawing on the vellum was executed in precise, dark charcoal lines. It was a registry portrait of a 7-year-old girl. She focused on the mechanical details first, delaying the terrifying emotional recognition. She saw the straight, formal posture required for imperial records. She saw the high, stiff collar of a southern noble house. Then she saw the 3 faint freckles resting exactly on the left collarbone. Finally, her gaze locked onto the center of the child's throat, where the artist had meticulously rendered a silver ivy leaf locket. The breath caught in her lungs, trapping the air like a stone, dropping through still water. The small, damp, scrubbing cloth she had forgotten, she was still holding in her left hand, slipped from her numb fingers. It landed soundlessly on the thick woven rug beneath her worn leather boots. Her right hand went completely cold. Without thinking, she pulled it from her apron pocket and pressed it flat against her own chest, right over the thick wool of her dress, where the actual silver locket rested hidden against her skin. The face staring back at her from the scarred leather wallet was her own. It was the face she had before the fire, before the frantic flight across the northern mountains, before she became a nameless maid scrubbing ash from castle floors. Alden Vane did not move. He sat perfectly still, offering no unnecessary words or aggressive demands, watching the exact moment the invisible kitchen servant realized her entire history was sitting on his desk. The quiet in the room was no longer the cautious stillness of a servant avoiding a master's wrath. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of an ancient treaty breaking open. Clara did not step back from the heavy oak desk. She did not raise her voice, nor did she feign ignorance to deny the image staring back at her from the lamplight. Her survival in the lower kitchens had always depended on accepting the brutal, physical reality of a room, and the portrait resting on the blotting pad was undeniably real. The charcoal lines were drawn with absolute mathematical precision. The young girl in the vellum sketch possessed her jawline, her cheekbones, and the unmistakable cluster of 3 faint freckles resting just above the collarbone. But it was the silver ivy leaf locket at the center of the drawing that anchored the truth. Slowly, with hands that smelled faintly of lye soap and damp hearth ash, Clara reached beneath the thick, scratchy wool of her uniform collar. Her fingers found the thin silver chain. It had rested against her skin for so long that the metal carried her own body heat, a permanent, hidden fixture of her quiet existence. She pulled it free, lifting the chain over her head with careful, deliberate movements. The pendant swayed briefly in the warm amber light of the study. It was a delicate, meticulously crafted piece, shaped like a curled ivy leaf, the veins etched deep into the silver with a master jeweler's tool. Alden Vane remained completely still in his high-backed chair. He did not lean forward to snatch the heirloom from her grasp. He did not crowd her physical space or demand she hand it over immediately. The king occupied silence the way a high magistrate waits for a witness to present the final, decisive page of a broken ledger. His restraint, absolute and unhurried, gave her the permission she needed to bridge the distance between them. Clara lowered the necklace onto the leather blotting pad, setting it down right beside the scarred leather wallet and the heavy vellum. The physical contrast was stark and deeply uncomfortable. A precious, sovereign artifact had just been placed by knuckles that were cracked, red, and raw from 10 freezing northern winters of scrubbing stone floors. "The clasp is hidden," she said. Her voice was flat, carrying no demand for pity, only the practical delivery of a fact. Most people who look at it think it is a solid piece of molded silver. It has no visible seam. She pressed her calloused thumb against the tiny stem of the silver leaf, applying a highly specific, angled pressure down against the metal. It was a trick of mechanics she had discovered when she was too small to understand exactly what she was hiding from the world. Click. The sound was incredibly faint, a tiny metallic snap echoing in the vast architecture of the royal study. To Alden, it was merely the sound of a microscopic hinge releasing its catch. To Clara, that single, sharp click was the rhythm of a decade spent in the dark. She had opened and closed it 1,000 times in the freezing cellar of the servant quarters, listening to the tiny mechanical heartbeat that proved she existed as a person before she became a piece of fortress inventory. The locket split open. The interior was completely empty, wiped clean of whatever miniature portrait or wax seal it might have once held. However, the inner rim bore a tiny, stamped insignia. It was a sovereign crest, matching the exact one drawn at the bottom corner of the charcoal registry portrait. The sovereign leaned forward, his dark eyes dropping to the exposed hinge. He studied the mechanical alignment without touching the silver. The physical artifact and the historical record were perfectly unified. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the northern winter wind rattling the heavy iron latches of the high-arched windows. The frost was pressing hard against the glass, but inside the study, the atmospheric pressure had irrevocably shifted. Alden let out a slow, measured breath. He did not look at her with sudden romantic reverence or the overwhelming possessive instinct of a pack leader claiming a prize. He looked at her with the heavy, solemn recognition of an architect who had just found the missing load-bearing pillar to a collapsing bridge. 10 years ago, the king began, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register that forced her to listen closely to every syllable. The southern territories fractured. The Vallon border purge was not a random peasant uprising, as the history clerks were instructed to record in the public archives. It was a systematic execution of the rightful ruling line by the border regents, who wanted uncontested control of the fertile riverlands. Clara kept her hands folded neatly over her stained apron, She knew absolutely nothing of southern politics or border treaties. She only knew the lingering smell of wood smoke in her childhood nightmares, and the chaotic memory of being shoved into a hollow wagon bed, buried under heavy, suffocating sacks of winter wheat. My brother understood the ancient treaty law better than anyone in this capital, Alden continued, his gaze fixing on the empty silver compartment resting on his desk. Eric knew that if the last legitimate Valen heir died, the province would legally fall into the hands of the usurpers through default inheritance, so he rode south, not with a royal army, but with a meager merchant convoy operating under the mundane guise of an agricultural inspection. The king shifted his weight, his broad shoulders stiffening beneath his dark velvet and wool tunic. The administrative detachment, in his tone, was wearing dangerously thin, revealing the raw, unhealed foundation of his personal grief. Eric found you before they did. He secured the portrait, documented the physical proof of your lineage for the registry, and hid you in a supply cart bound for the northern fortress. Alden stopped speaking, his jaw tightened into a hard, inflexible line of bone, pressing sharply against his skin. Clara watched his large knuckles turn a stark white where they gripped the wooden edge of the desk. The sheer mental control the man exerted over his own sorrow was absolute. He refused to let the emotion break his posture. They did not make it past the border, Alden said. When he spoke the next sentence, his voice cracked. It was a microscopic, devastating fracture in a foundation of solid stone. The convoy was ambushed at the Kalan Mountain Pass. The name of the location hung in the air, heavy with the metallic scent of old blood and unresolved justice. Eric ordered the driver to take your cart off the main commercial road and hide it deep within the frozen timber trails, Alden managed to say, smoothing out the break in his tone through sheer force of will. He and his royal guard held the pass against the mercenaries. They bought your cart exactly 30 minutes of time before they were overrun. It was enough. Clara looked down at the scarred leather wallet resting on the desk. The dark, rusted stains on the worn edges were not spilled ink. She felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. The man who had saved her had not simply abandoned her to a life of scrubbing kitchens. He had died bleeding on a freezing mountain road so she could live long enough to clean them. When my border patrols finally found my brother's ruined caravan 3 days later, they recovered this wallet from the inside pocket of his coat. Alden murmured, reaching out to touch the cracked leather with immense, quiet reverence. But the supply cart was gone. The tracks were buried in the blizzard. We logically assumed it had been forced off the cliffs into the ravine. I have spent a decade believing the Valen heir died in the snow, taking my brother's final sacrifice with her to the bottom of the gorge. He finally looked up from the desk, meeting her eyes. The vast, insurmountable distance of class, rank, and servitude vanished entirely in the span of a single exhale. "You did not die," Alden stated, the words cementing themselves into the quiet room like a binding legal decree. "You survived in my own fortress." The narrow stone corridor leading back to the scullery maid quarters felt different under Clara Finch's boots. It was the same uneven flagstone she had scrubbed on her hands and knees for years, carrying the same draft that smelled of wet ash and old cellar damp. Yet the geometry of the space had irrevocably shifted. She closed the splintered wooden door to her tiny alcove, sliding the rusty iron latch into place. The air inside was freezing, carrying the familiar bite of the northern wind that seeped through the unmortared cracks. Clara did not reach for her meager pile of kindling. Instead, she sat on the edge of her rope-strung cot, uncurling her stiff fingers. The silver ivy-leaf locket rested in the center of her palm. In the dim, wavering light of the corridor torch, bleeding through the floorboards above, the metal looked dull, stripped of any inherent magic. It was just a small piece of meticulously crafted silver. She traced the delicate veins carved into the metallic leaf, her calloused thumb catching on the tiny hinge. For years, she had carried it as a token of abandonment. It had been the only proof she had once belonged to someone, even if they had left her behind to vanish into the anonymity of the northern workforce. That had been a survivable pain, a cold, predictable ache she knew exactly how to manage. This new reality possessed a terrible, crushing weight. Clara let her head bow, the cold chain slipping through her fingers like frozen water. She had not been discarded, she had been saved. Eric Vane, a prince of the blood, had died on a freezing mountain pass to secure her escape. He had taken arrows to his chest, bleeding out into the winter soil, solely so that a terrified southern child could slip across the border undetected. Her breath hitched, sharp and shallow in the quiet room. Someone had given their life so she could survive to scrub the soot from the fortress hearths, so she could wash the heavy wool cloaks until her knuckles cracked and bled in the freezing water. Every morning she had woken up before dawn to sweep the grand halls, unaware that her right to hold the broom had been purchased with royal sacrifice. The sheer cost of her existence settled onto her shoulders, heavier than any load of wet linen she had ever carried. She pressed the silver ivy leaf locket against her collarbone, letting the cold metal ground her beating heart. Silence was a familiar refuge, but tonight the quiet of her tiny room felt like a massive debt she could never repay. Her survival was not a quiet accident. It was a sovereign investment paid in blood. She did not have long to sit in the dark. Less than an hour later, the heavy tread of armored boots echoed down the servants' corridor, stopping precisely outside her alcove. A sharp, singular knock against the splintered wood broke the silence. Alden Vane did not send a lower officer to collect her. When Clara Finch pulled back the rusty latch, the Alpha King stood in the narrow, soot-stained hallway, his presence occupying the cramped space with absolute, unhurried authority. He wore a heavy wool cloak trimmed in black fur, his expression composed, entirely unbothered by the damp cellar conditions. 2 elite guards stood at attention behind him, their faces impassive in the torchlight. "Gather whatever you wish to keep," Alden said. His voice was low, devoid of command, offering only a steady, practical instruction. "You will not sleep in this wing tonight, nor ever again." Clara did not argue. She possessed nothing of value besides the locket, now resting securely against her skin. She folded her single spare apron, placed it over her arm, and followed him up the winding stone stairs. They moved upward, past the service levels and bypassing the administrative floors until they reached the high, secure wing of the inner keep. The air here smelled of clean pine rather than lye. Alden paused before a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands, unlocking it himself with an iron key. He pushed it open, stepping back and gesturing for her to enter. The chamber was overwhelmingly warm. A massive hearth fire crackled, filling the room with the scent of burning cedar and melted beeswax. The walls were draped in heavy tapestries to block the northern wind. Alden remained firmly on the threshold. He did not cross into her private space. "There are guards stationed at both ends of this corridor," Alden stated, his dark eyes sweeping over her calm posture to ensure she understood the logistics of her safety. "No one enters without my seal. Not the kitchen master, not the council elders. You are under the sovereign protection of the crown." He inclined his head slightly, a quiet gesture of profound respect that made her pulse jump, before he pulled the door shut. The heavy lock clicked into place, sealing her inside. Clara stood alone in the center of the vast room. She moved slowly toward the hearth, testing the thick woven rug beneath her worn boots. The bed was enormous, piled high with thick furs and pristine, shimmering silk sheets. She reached out, running a rough, blistered hand over the delicate fabric. It was entirely too smooth. There was no friction, no coarse wool to anchor her to the physical world. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the softness yielding instantly beneath her weight. It felt entirely wrong. For a decade, the familiar hardness of the kitchen cot had told her exactly where her boundaries lay. The tight, unyielding rope had kept her grounded, reminding her to stay vigilant, to keep her muscles tense against the cold. Here, surrounded by the overwhelming warmth and the suffocating luxury of the silk sheets, Clara felt a deep, profound sensory displacement. The safety of the room felt like an unearned luxury. She pulled her knees to her chest, curling into a tight defensive knot atop the flawless silk. She closed her eyes, missing the freezing drafts of the cellar, trying to calibrate her breathing. While waiting for the dawn to break, iron-rimmed wheels crushed, the thin layer of morning frost coating the outer courtyard, announcing the arrival long before the heralds sounded their horns. The sound echoed through the stone corridors of the royal fortress, sharp and unyielding. Alden sat at the head of the formal receiving hall, his posture perfectly still, watching the massive oak doors. He did not go out to the freezing steps to greet his guest. Sovereignty in the north was measured by who moved first, and the king intended to let the Lord Regent of Vallon come to him. When the heavy doors finally swung inward, they let in a rush of bitter wind and the overpowering scent of rich myrrh. Gerald Cross entered the austere hall with the unhurried, sweeping grace of a man who believed he owned the floor beneath his boots. The southern lord wore thick layers of crimson velvet and dark sable fur, a sharp, ostentatious contrast to the bare grey stone and pale winter light of the keep. His entourage trailed behind him, a carefully curated display of wealth and bureaucratic power, carrying locked dispatch boxes and leather-bound ledgers meant to intimidate the provincial clerks. The monarch did not stand immediately. He let the silence stretch, forcing the southern delegation to halt their procession in the center of the room and wait for permission to approach the dais. Only when the quiet became a physical weight in the grand hall did the king rise. "Lord Regent," Alden said. His voice was a low, even cadence that required no volume to command the vast space. "The winter roads are unforgiving this time of year. Your journey through the mountain pass must have been taxing." "A necessary burden, Your Majesty," the man replied, offering a bow that was exactly 1 degree too shallow. His smile was polished, an immaculate performance of diplomatic warmth that did not reach his pale eyes. "The southern provinces thrive under your broader protection, but matters of administration occasionally require a personal touch. One cannot rely entirely on ravens and ink to manage a legacy." A servant stepped forward from the shadows of the colonnade, carrying a silver tray bearing 2 goblets of the local northern vintage. The wine was heavily spiced with pine resin and dried cloves, a sharp, warming drink meant to cut through the freezing draughts of the castle. The servant offered the first goblet to the guest, his head respectfully bowed. Before the silver cup could be taken, the Lord Regent raised a single gloved hand. The gesture was incredibly slight, yet the servant froze in place. "I must decline your generous hospitality," the southerner murmured, his tone dripping with practiced regret. "The northern frost sits too heavily on my chest. My physician has prescribed a rather strict regimen to keep the chill away." Without waiting for a response, he flicked 2 fingers toward his own attendant. The man immediately produced a crystal decanter from a velvet-lined travel box. He poured a heavy, dark red vintage into a glass he had brought with him. The rich aroma of fermented plums and southern sun filled the space between them, overwriting the sharp, practical scent of the northern pine. It was a flawlessly executed, silent insult. By refusing the bread and wine of the host, the guest refused to acknowledge the absolute authority of the roof he stood under. The king watched the dark red liquid settle in the crystal glass. He did not react. He did not narrow his eyes, nor did he tighten his grip on his own silver goblet. He simply observed the calculated theatre, letting the implication hang in the freezing air. "To your continued health, then," the sovereign said quietly, taking a slow sip of the spiced wine. "And to the longevity of your reign," his guest replied, tasting the dark red vintage. The smile returned, sharper this time. "Though longevity often depends on maintaining a very tight ledger, does it not?" The pleasantries evaporated as the crystal glass was set down on the polished oak table. The Southern Lord signalled his clerk, who stepped forward and unrolled a thick sheet of parchment on the table between them. The document sounded like dry leaves scraping over stone. It was heavy with wax seals, a formal bureaucratic writ pressed with the green falcon crest of the Southern courts. "I come to you with a matter of deep humanitarian concern," Gerald began, tracing the edge of the parchment with a manicured thumbnail. "The Valen province has suffered terribly in the years since the border purge. Many families were scattered, lives were fractured. As Lord Regent, it is my sacred duty to ensure that the bloodlines of my people are kept intact." The king remained motionless, his gaze resting on the green wax seals rather than the man's face. The North has always provided sanctuary to those fleeing conflict. Our borders are governed by law, not by lineage. A noble sentiment, the other man agreed smoothly, but an incomplete one. We have reason to believe that several unregistered Southern refugees slipped into your domestic workforce during the chaos of the purge. Children separated from their rightful estates. Wards of the province, who are currently toiling in kitchens and laundries, entirely unaware of the noble houses that weep for their return. The lie was meticulously crafted. It was not a demand for an escaped political prisoner. It was framed as a benevolent rescue mission. The politician masked his predatory intent behind a veneer of legalistic concern, weaponizing the very concept of sanctuary. "I respectfully request your royal permission to inspect the domestic staff of this fortress," the Lord Regent continued, tapping the center of the parchment. "A simple administrative review. We only wish to restore family heritages, to return these lost daughters to the estates they rightfully inherit." Alden kept his breathing perfectly measured, letting the silence stretch across the table. Under the pretense of restoring heritage, this man intended to legally trap and execute the final heir to the Valen Treaty. The king knew exactly who the Southerner was hunting. Clara was currently locked behind iron-reinforced doors in a secure wing of the palace, guarded by men who would not hesitate to draw steel. But raw force was not how this battle would be won. If the sovereign denied the search outright without legal cause, he would validate the suspicion that the North was harboring a political fugitive, triggering a treaty crisis that would end in a border war. Instead of anger, the monarch offered a mild bureaucratic indifference. "An admirable goal," the king said softly. He set his silver goblet down next to the parchment. "However, the domestic workforce of the royal fortress is governed strictly under the sovereignty of the Crown's Labour Decree. Our registries are closed to external audit without a sworn tribunal." The polished smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I hold a writ of inquiry from the Valen courts." "Your writ is valid in the southern valleys," the sovereign corrected, his voice dropping in volume, forcing the other man to strain slightly to hear him. "Here, it is merely a piece of paper. If you wish to inspect my kitchens, you must first file a formal petition with the archive keeper, detailing exactly who you are looking for. Names, birthmarks, lineage records. Only then will I consider unlocking my ledgers." "I am trying to repatriate lost citizens," the Southerner pressed, his voice tightening with a thin edge of irritation as he realized the procedural trap. "Surely your Majesty does not wish to keep noble blood scrubbing hearths." "I wish to follow the law," Alden answered, standing up. The conversation was over. "The archive keeper will expect your detailed petition by morning. Until then, enjoy the hospitality of the guest wing." Clara stood by the narrow window of the secure suite, watching grey snowdrift over the courtyard stones. The silence here felt heavy, lacking the familiar clatter of iron pots and the hiss of boiling water that had defined her existence. Her fingers rested against her collarbone, finding the shape of the silver ivy leaf locket beneath her fine wool gown. The heavy oak door opened with a deliberate groan of forged iron, and Alden Vane stepped into the room. He occupied silence the way other men occupied speech. Without apology, without the impulse to fill it. He waited until she turned from the frost-rimed glass, acknowledging her space before fully entering. "He is here," the king said, his steady rumble barely disturbing the quiet air. "Lord Regent Cross has arrived at the fortress." He demanded a formal audience and asked to inspect the domestic staff for unregistered refugees. Clara felt a chill that came not from the winter wind, but from the sudden proximity of an old threat, Gerald Cross. The name carried the weight of stolen lands and forged decrees. She had spent her life learning to be an invisible ghost in a busy kitchen, but ghosts could not stand before a sovereign tribunal. Alden stopped beside the oak table, maintaining a careful distance. He reached into his dark wool cloak and withdrew a heavy, intricately cut brass key. The dull metal caught the pale light as he placed it on the polished wood. "You are under the protection of my elite guard," Alden said, his gaze meeting hers with unhurried certainty. "There are armed men stationed at the end of this corridor and directly outside this door. But protection that relies entirely on the strength of others is merely another form of captivity. In the kitchens, keys were held only by masters. Servants were meant to be accessible, their spaces open to inspection at any hour. A locked door was the ultimate marker of sovereign rank." "Take it," he instructed quietly. She picked up the key. The cold metal bit into her calloused palm like a promise. Alden guided her to the thick, iron-bound door and pointed to the deep lock mechanism. "Insert the key and turn it," he said, stepping back. Clara slid the brass shaft into the keyhole. It fit with precise friction. She applied pressure, feeling the mechanical resistance yield until the iron deadbolt slid perfectly into place, with a sharp, resounding click. At his nod, she turned it back to the left, the bolt retracting with a solid thud. "This is your door," the king said, watching the steady movement of her hands. "My men will keep the corridor clear, but you control this threshold. No one enters unless you turn that key. Not my guards, not Gerald Cross, not me." The gesture was not a display of royal power, nor a declaration of possessive dominance. It was a tactical transfer of agency. He was giving her the authority to lock the world out. She let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. Slow, thorough, filling every crack. By late afternoon, the muted grey light of the northern winter had deepened into a bruised purple dusk. A measured, rhythmic double knock broke the silence of the secure suite. Clara approached the heavy oak door. Her hand closing over the brass key, she turned the tumbler, retracting the iron bolt, and pulled the door inward. Alden stood in the torchlit corridor. Beside him stood an older woman with a severe, immaculate knot of grey hair. She wore the unadorned robes of the royal archives, carrying a massive iron-clasped volume wrapped in oiled canvas. "Clara," Alden said, his voice dropping to a low, respectful register, "this is Brenda Thorne, the keeper of the Northern Archives. She has brought the evidence." Brenda did not offer a curtsy, nor did she smile. Her sharp, analytical eyes assessed Clara with the pragmatic calculation of a ledger keeper checking a column of figures. She noted the calloused hands, the straight posture, and gave a single approving nod. "May I come in, my lady?" Brenda asked, her voice as dry as the parchment she guarded. "You may," Clara answered, stepping aside. Brenda moved to the table, setting the canvas-wrapped bundle down with immense care. Before unbuckling the leather straps, she walked to a copper basin in the corner and rolled up the cuffs of her dark robes. "The journey from the lower vaults is dusty," Brenda stated, working up a thin lather with a block of hard lysé soap, "and the Imperial Registry of Vallon does not suffer the indignity of unwashed hands. The oils from human skin degrade the vellum." Alden stepped back, allowing the archivist to command the space. This was the nature of northern justice. It did not rely on the loudest voice or the sharpest sword, but on the meticulous, unyielding adherence to procedure. After rinsing and drying her hands thoroughly on clean linen, Brenda returned to the table. She unfastened the straps and folded back the canvas, revealing a tome bound in cracked, blackened leather, and reinforced with tarnished silver corner pieces. It smelled faintly of beeswax, old dust, and the slow passage of time. Brenda laid her clean hands flat against the cover in quiet reverence before lifting it open. The thick vellum pages crackled softly, like dry leaves in a winter wind. The dense script inside was written in an archaic, flowing hand using ink that had faded to a rusty brown. The usurpers in the south have relied on the assumption that this book burned during the border purge, Brenda said, her finger tracing the edge of a page without touching the ink itself. Lord Regent Cross built his entire claim on the absence of documentation. He assumes that because the physical bodies of the royal line were erased, the legal reality of their existence was erased as well. She turned another heavy page, the vellum whispering against the silence. But the Northern archives do not burn, and we do not forget, the archivist continued, focusing solely on the structural truth before her. Here, recorded 32 years ago, is the lineage of the Vallon sovereign line, signed, witnessed, and sealed by the blood treaty of the 5 provinces. Clara stepped closer. She did not know how to read the High Court script, but she recognized the geometry of the pages, the precise margins, the weight of history pressed into the parchment. This was administrative truth, preserved through decades of silence by people who believed that ink and paper could outlast treason. The secret archives deep beneath the northern fortress smelled of dry parchment, crushed rosemary, and the slow, steady burn of beeswax candles. The heavy oak reading table in the center of the room held the ancient weight of the Imperial Registry of Vallon. Brenda Thorne did not rush. The archivist's hands, dusted faintly with chalk to prevent moisture transfer, moved with absolute, practiced precision. She used a polished bone folder to turn the thick vellum pages, letting the material settle before smoothing it flat against the table. Alden Vane stood just outside the pool of amber candlelight. He occupied the silence without the nervous impulse to fill it, his posture straight, his attention fixed entirely on the ledger. He did not hover or issue commands. The Alpha King understood that authority here belonged to the physical record, and to the woman who guarded it. He waited for the evidence to speak. Clara Finch stood beside him, her breathing carefully regulated. For years, she had survived by calculating the exact geometry of a room, keeping her eyes lowered, making sure her presence disturbed no one. Now, she was positioned at the very center of the fortress's hidden power structure, watching an archivist hunt for her existence in a book older than the stones above them. The southern province maintained strict administrative protocols, Brenda murmured, her gruff voice cutting through the quiet. She adjusted a brass magnifying lens over a densely written page. During the years leading up to the border purge, the regional lords began falsifying tax ledgers to drain the territory's wealth, but the sovereign line kept a separate sealed registry. This volume, Brenda carefully rotated the heavy book. The leather binding creaked, a sound like frozen timber shifting in the winter wind. She selected a thin silver caliper from her wooden toolbox and aligned it against the margins of a specific entry. They used a highly specific formulation of gold ink for the direct heirs, the archivist continued, tapping the caliper against a line of text. It contains trace elements of pulverized copper and northern resin, designed to oxidize slightly over the decades, proving its age. A forgery drawn today would shine too brightly. Clara leaned forward slightly, her eyes adjusting to the intricate script. There, pressed into the heavy vellum, was a line of text that had survived a massacre, a long mountain crossing, and years of deliberate erasure. Written in that dull, oxidized gold ink was her name. Beside the lettering sat a raised circle of crimson wax. It was the seal of her late mother. The stamp was flawless, capturing the precise ridges of the Vallon sovereign crest. It was not a rumor, nor a biological guess. It was structural, undeniable truth, bound in leather, and preserved by the very laws the usurpers claimed to uphold. Brenda lifted the magnifying glass and stepped back. The ink composition is perfect. The pressure of the wax seal is consistent with the imperial signet ring. The entry is authentic. Alden stepped closer to the table, his gaze dropping to the gold letters. He did not reach out to touch the fragile page. He simply let the knowledge settle into the room, cold and final. Clara stared at the crimson wax, the intricate ridges catching the candlelight. Beneath the heavy collar of her borrowed wool gown, her silver ivy leaf locket felt suddenly heavy against her skin. For so long, it had been a dangerous secret, a piece of metal she kept hidden in the damp cellar kitchens to avoid questions she could not answer. Now, it was the physical anchor tying her to the gold ink on the page. Her fingers moved to her throat. She drew the silver chain upward, lifting the heirloom into the ambient light. The metal was cool, polished by years of friction against rough linen. She unclasped the delicate hinge, opening the ivy leaf to reveal the empty compartment inside. "Bring it closer," Brenda instructed quietly, sliding a fresh sheet of protective parchment beneath the registry's page to catch any dust. Clara stepped to the edge of the oak table. She lowered the open locket, holding it hovering just above the ancient paper. The dimensions of the carved ivy matched the sovereign crest perfectly, but that was not what held her attention. Her eyes dropped from the wax seal to the handwritten signature beneath it, her mother's name, inscribed in swift, angled strokes of black iron gall ink. She turned the silver piece slightly, letting the candlelight illuminate the microscopic scratches hidden on the inner curve of the clasp. She had always assumed those marks were simply the result of wear, the accidental damage of a long, brutal journey across the mountain pass. But under the direct glow of the beeswax candle, the pattern became undeniable. The scratches were deliberate. They were carved with the tip of a sewing needle, forming tiny, angled letters. "The strokes," Clara whispered, her voice barely breaking the heavy silence of the archive. She kept her hand absolutely steady, though the temperature in her chest felt like dropping stone. The way the cross of the letter A tilts downward, the sharp hook at the bottom of the L. Alden moved to stand beside her. He did not crowd her space, nor did he offer unnecessary words of comfort. He simply offered his towering, quiet presence, leaning slightly to observe the physical comparison she was making. Clara looked from the ancient signature in the registry to the crude, desperate carving inside her jewelry. It's the same handwriting. She carved her own initials into the clasp. She knew she couldn't keep the signet ring, so she marked the locket. A profound silence settled over the reading table. This was not merely legal evidence. It was a mother's final, meticulous act of preservation, a silent message sent forward through years of isolation and fear. The realization did not make Clara weep. She had spent too much of her life learning not to cry in front of people who held power over her. Instead, the certainty lodged in her chest like a sliver of cold glass, sharp and grounding. Alden's hand shifted, his knuckles resting lightly against the edge of the oak table, just inches from hers. It was a deliberate placement, a physical boundary drawn between her and the crushing weight of the past. "She left no room for doubt," Alden said, his low voice vibrating in the quiet room. "She built a lock that only you could open, and she trusted that my brother would get you far enough away to use it." Clara traced the edge of the silver ivy leaf, feeling the tiny scratches one last time. The connection was unbroken. The bridge between the dead woman who had signed the Southern Registry and the silent maid who had scrubbed northern floors was now forged in silver and gold ink. She closed the locket with a soft, metallic click, the sound sealing the truth into place. The High Council Hall of the Northern Fortress smelled of burning tallow and old dust. It was a cavernous room built for war, constructed from massive blocks of grey granite that seemed to absorb the heat of the central hearth without holding it. Around the semicircular oak table sat the regional lords and elder witnesses, their heavy wool cloaks drawn tight against the pervasive draught. At the centre of the chamber stood Lord Regent Gerald. He wore the velvet and embroidered silk of a man who fought his battles in ledgers. His movements were unhurried, polished to a deliberate gleam. He rested his manicured hands on the edge of the great oak table, surveying the gathered elders with a look of practiced sorrow that did not reach his calculating eyes. "It is a tragic reality," Gerald began, his voice projecting smoothly off the cold stone walls. "But we must finally accept it. The Valen province has suffered for too long under the uncertainty of a fractured bloodline. We can no longer wait for ghosts." With a practiced flourish, he signaled his attendant. A heavy wooden box was brought forward, its iron hinges whining softly. From it the antagonist withdrew a stack of parchment documents, laying them out across the council table. The heavy paper was crisp, and each sheet bore a wax seal pressed with the emblem of the southern border magistrates. "I present the formal death certificates for the remaining heirs of the southern line," the Lord Regent declared, "signed and verified by the border magistrates of 3 separate territories over the past decade. The line is extinct." He paused, letting the silence of the hall stretch. "By the laws of the territorial blood treaties, an abandoned province must fall to its acting regent. I have governed Valen in the absence of a sovereign. Now I formally demand that this council grant me permanent authority to claim the province." Alpha King Alden sat at the head of the table. He did not lean forward to inspect the forged certificates. His large, scarred hands rested flat against the arms of his wooden chair. He simply watched the smooth performance, his expression an impenetrable mask of northern winter. The king understood the mechanics of Gerald's ambition. It was a theft executed through ink and paid signatures. You rely heavily on the word of border magistrates. Alden finally spoke. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that instantly commanded the vast room. "I rely on the law, King Alden," Gerald replied, dipping his head in a shallow bow. "The documents are impeccable. There is no living proof to contradict them. The law requires this council to recognize the transition of power." Alden's gaze remained fixed on the crisp parchments. He knew exactly what it cost to procure such flawless forgeries. It was a neat, clinical execution of a dynasty. "The law," the king repeated quietly. "Yes, we value physical proof above all else." The heavy iron-bound doors at the far end of the council hall groaned in protest as the guards pulled them open. The sudden draft caused the tallow candles to flicker. Every head turned toward the threshold. Alden rose slowly from his seat at the head of the table. He did not announce the new arrival with a grand proclamation. He simply extended his hand toward the open doorway, offering a silent anchor in the vast space. Clara stepped into the hall. She did not look like a lost princess returning to claim her throne, and she had deliberately chosen not to. When the royal attendants had offered her chests of velvet gowns, she had quietly refused them all. To wear the costumes of the court would be a surrender of her reality. Instead, she wore a simple, high-collared gown of dark charcoal wool, the fabric heavy and practical against the northern cold. Her dark hair was pulled back in the severe, practical braid she had worn while scrubbing the castle hearths. Her posture was straight, set with the rigid control of a woman who had spent years learning how to remain perfectly still. The only adornment she wore rested against the dark wool at her throat, the silver ivy leaf locket. It was not polished to a blinding shine. The metal still bore the tiny scratches and dull patina of a lifetime spent hidden beneath coarse aprons, but against the stark backdrop of the plain gown, the sovereign heirloom was impossible to miss. Gerald faltered, his hand, which had been resting confidently on the forged death certificates, twitched. His smooth smile cracked at the edges as his gaze darted from the young woman's face to the unmistakable silver emblem. He recognized the shape of the ivy leaf. He recognized the quiet eyes that were a mirror of the southern dynasty he had spent a decade trying to erase. Clara walked the length of the hall without rushing. Her flat-soled leather shoes made almost no sound against the stone. She kept her eyes fixed on the empty space beside the Alpha King's chair, navigating the treacherous political geometry of the room with the same meticulous care she used when balancing a tray of fragile teacups. Alden waited until she reached the head of the table. He did not attempt to physically guide her. He merely stepped back, yielding the space at his right hand, allowing her to stand as an equal. "You bring a servant to the High Council, King Alden," the Lord Regent demanded, his voice pitching higher. His panic manifested in the sudden tightness of his jaw and the erratic tapping of his fingers against the wood. "This is a violation of protocol. This is a presentation of evidence," the king answered, his tone unyielding. Clara stood motionless. She felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation, as she looked at the man who had stolen her family's lands. Gerald Cross had built his empire on the assumption that she was dead, and now his bureaucratic fortress was beginning to crumble. She reached up, her calloused fingers lightly tracing the edge of the silver ivy leaf locket. She did not speak. Her quiet presence and the undeniable physical proof hanging around her neck were already doing the work of dismantling a decade of lies. The silence in the hall was no longer the heavy quiet of defeat. It was the breathless stillness of a system realizing the truth had outlasted the fraud. The High Council chamber was built for judgment. Its walls were constructed from unpolished black granite, absorbing sound rather than reflecting it. At the center of the room sat a massive table of scarred northern oak. Gerald Cross leaned forward in his high-backed chair, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm. He had spent the morning delivering performative arguments regarding the extinction of the Southern Line, expecting a political debate over borders and grain shipments. He did not expect Brenda Thorne. The head archivist moved with unhurried precision, her boots silent against the cold stone floor. In her arms, she carried the Imperial Registry of Valen. The cracked leather binding smelled of old dust and cold iron. When she set the massive volume onto the center of the oak table, the heavy thud caused the nearest councilman to flinch. Gerald's drumming abruptly stopped. "You bring old books to a matter of state, archivist," Gerald said, projecting an air of bored tolerance. "The Valen line is broken. We have already established that the birth records were destroyed in the purge." Brenda did not engage with his performance. From the pocket of her woolen coat, she retrieved a protective sleeve of clear vellum. Inside lay the charcoal registry portrait. She placed it beside the ancient ledger, smoothing her ink-stained fingers over the edges. "The records were not destroyed, Lord Regent," Brenda stated, her tone purely academic. "They were merely relocated." She pulled a heavy, brass-rimmed magnifying lens from her satchel and gestured for the three eldest councilmen to approach the table. Gerald scoffed, attempting to maintain his veneer of control. A charcoal sketch, found in the wallet of a dead prince, any skilled hand could forge the likeness of a child. "A skilled hand can forge ink," Brenda corrected quietly, setting the lens down. "No hand can forge the biology of paper." The eldest councilman leaned over the table, pressing his eye to the brass lens. Brenda carefully opened the Imperial Registry of Valen, turning the fragile pages to a specific entry. The page was incomplete. A large, rectangular section had been roughly torn from the parchment decades ago. "Look at the fibers," the archivist instructed, pointing with a silver quill. The vellum used for the royal registry was milled specifically for the Valen court, pressed with a microscopic lattice of silk thread to prevent tampering. Examine the torn edge of the ledger. Now, examine the left edge of the charcoal registry portrait. The chamber descended into suffocating silence. Under the thick glass, the frayed fibers of the torn ledger page aligned perfectly, strand for strand, with the jagged edge of the portrait. The microscopic lattice of silk thread connected flawlessly across the divide. "It is a forensic match," the councilman whispered. The paper was torn directly from this page. "Prince Eric did not just take the child," Brenda explained, her voice carrying the steady weight of historical truth. "He took the physical proof of her birth. The watermark of the sovereign seal is pressed directly into the center of the sketch. It is not a forgery. It is the missing fraction of the imperial log. Gerald's posture collapsed inward. The arrogant confidence drained from his face, leaving only the sharp geometry of panic. He stared at the aligned paper fibers, unable to form a counter-argument against the concrete reality of physical science. The charcoal registry portrait belonged to the book, and the girl in the portrait belonged to the throne. Clara Finch stood perfectly still beside Alden Vane, not reacting to the shift in the room's atmosphere. Years of scrubbing stone floors and folding heavy linens had taught her the strategic value of remaining an observer. She kept her hands folded over the dark fabric of her gown. Beside her, the Alpha King occupied his space with his signature restraint. He had not raised his voice once. The evidence had spoken on his behalf. Alden gave a subtle nod to the guards stationed by the heavy iron doors. Two stepped forward, carrying a small, incredibly dense object. They set it down on the far end of the council table. It was the sovereign dispatch box of Vallon. The box was forged from black iron, encrusted with decades of oxidation. It lacked ornate jewels or gold filigree, designed instead to survive fire and siege. At its center sat a complex brass locking mechanism, shaped roughly like a cluster of overlapping vines. Gerald Cross grasped at his final defense. "The box is sealed," the Lord Regent snapped, his voice tight with desperation. "The old laws state that the dispatch box can only be opened by the blood of the sovereign. A laundry maid cannot awaken the iron." Alden finally looked directly at the Lord Regent, his expression entirely devoid of pity. "The North does not rely on blood magic to govern its borders, Gerald. We rely on engineering, and we rely on the law." The king turned to Clara. He did not issue a command. He simply offered her the space, stepping back so she could approach the table. Clara moved forward. Her breath was slow and controlled. She reached up to the high collar of her gown and unclasped the silver ivy leaf locket. The metal was warm from her skin. For years, it had been a hidden weight guarded out of survival. Now, under the harsh light of the iron chandelier, she let the chain slip away, holding the pendant by its edges. The silver ivy leaf locket was not merely a decorative heirloom. As Clara held it to the light, the council could see the precise, asymmetrical grooves cut into the underside of the silver leaves. It had thickness, weight, and a mechanical purpose. She stopped in front of the sovereign dispatch box. The brass locking mechanism matched the negative space of the pendant perfectly. Clara did not hesitate. Her hands, bearing the faint calluses of domestic labor, were entirely steady. She pressed the silver ivy leaf locket directly into the center of the brass vines. It slid into the slot with a quiet, precise friction. Clara turned the locket clockwise. The sound that followed was not a magical hum or a mystical resonance. It was the heavy, satisfying clack of dropping tumblers. The brass mechanism ground against decades of internal resistance, the physical gears engaging for the first time in a generation. With an echoing metallic thud, the internal deadbolts retracted. Clara pulled her hands back. The heavy iron lid of the box sprang open on its spring-loaded hinges. A wave of preserved air drifted out, the distinct scent of old cedar, sealing wax and cured parchment. Inside the iron walls lay the original, unadulterated treaties of the Southern Territories, waiting for their rightful owner. The entire council hall fell into absolute silence. The mechanism had proven her lineage without a single drop of spilled blood. The verification was entirely mechanical, rooted in the careful engineering of her ancestors. Clara looked down at the open box, letting the reality of the moment settle in her chest like a stone dropping through still water. She had hidden the key for her entire life, terrified of what it might bring. Now the key rested securely in the lock, claiming the space she had always been denied. Alden stepped up beside her. He did not touch her, nor did he claim the victory as his own. He stood parallel to her, a silent guardian bearing witness to her restoration. His gaze swept over the council, lingering on the pale, defeated face of Gerald Cross. The truth was not just known, it had been systematically, undeniably proven. The heavy iron hinges of the sovereign dispatch box had already settled into stillness, but the sharp echo of their opening seemed to linger in the vast, cold stone chamber. Inside the box rested the treaty, a thick roll of aged vellum bound by a ribbon of faded green velvet. Brenda Thorne stepped forward with her usual unhurried, administrative precision. She lifted the document, her ink-stained fingers sliding over the brittle yellowed edges, and laid it completely flat against the center of the massive oak council table. She positioned it directly beside the open, heavy spine of the Imperial Registry of Vallon. Gerald Cross did not speak. The Lord Regent stood rigid at the edge of the witness circle, the arrogant flush completely drained from his cheeks. His hands hung loosely at his sides, his fingers twitching faintly, as if searching for a legal loophole in the empty, freezing air. The bureaucratic machinery he had manipulated for years to systematically strip the southern borders had finally turned its crushing weight against him. He was not defeated by a sudden, chaotic battle, nor by a show of raw territorial force, but by the undeniable mathematical certainty of an unbroken bloodline recorded in black ink. Clara Finch looked down at the parchment. The terms of the historic Vallon Northern Alliance were written in meticulous, sweeping calligraphy, detailing the immediate cessation of Gerald's corrupt regency and the absolute restoration of the southern ancestral borders. Beside the sprawling document, an iron pen rested in a narrow groove of polished black marble. Alden Vane stepped up to the edge of the table. He did not issue a loud command to the assembled council, nor did he look toward Gerald with any victorious malice. Instead, the Alpha King occupied the space beside Clara with the stillness of a compass needle finding north. His presence was not a cage of possession, but a deliberate barrier between her and the suffocating pressure of the elite lords watching their every move. "The registry is verified," Alden said, his voice low, steady, and carrying effortlessly across the quiet stone room. "The sovereign line is intact. The regency is hereby dissolved." Clara reached for the iron pen. For a fraction of a second, she felt the familiar, rough texture of her own skin. The heavy calluses earned from years of scrubbing ash and grease in the freezing kitchen cellars. The small, faded white scars from carrying heavy, scalding copper pots. Those hands did not look like the delicate, pampered hands of a provincial heir, but they were steady. She gripped the cold metal barrel of the pen, letting the sharp chill ground her racing pulse. She did not hesitate, not because she was immune to the suffocating weight of the room, but because she knew Prince Eric Vane had died on a frozen mountain pass precisely so she could hold this pen today. She dipped the nib deep into the heavy glass well. The ink was dark, smelling faintly of crushed oak galls, copper and pine resin. Leaning forward, she pressed the iron tip to the very bottom of the vellum. The sharp scratching sound of metal against dry parchment was the only noise permitted in the grand hall. She wrote the name she had never been allowed to speak aloud, the name that had survived assassins, poverty, and silence. Clara Finch Vallon. The thick ink pooled slightly on the final curve of the letter, then began to dry into the paper in the drafty northern air. She set the pen down. Gerald Cross exhaled a shallow, ragged breath. He looked from the fresh signature to the Imperial Registry of Vallon, and finally up to Clara's face. His jaw worked, but no words came out. The legal extraction of his stolen power was complete. There would be no debate, no prolonged tribunal, and no desperate appeal. The treaty was signed, witnessed, and bound. The girl he had dismissed as a common, invisible servant was now the undisputed sovereign of the very lands he had tried to consume. 3 weeks later, the bitter northern winds gave way to the milder, damp air of the southern territories. The journey down from the mountain fortress had been measured and quiet, flanked by the king's elite guard, but now the heavy carriage wheels had finally ground to a halt. Clara walked slowly through the rusted, wrought iron gates of the Southern Valley Garden. The ancestral estate had been left completely untouched for years, overgrown with wild briar and aggressive climbing vines that swallowed the intricate stone trellises. It was not ruined. It was simply waiting to be remembered. The air here did not smell of freezing mountain granite or wood smoke. Instead, it carried the deep, rich scent of wet soil, crushed rosemary, ozone, and ancient cedar. She moved carefully along the broken cobblestone path, the hem of her dark traveling cloak brushing gently against the damp, heavy ferns. At her throat, resting openly against the dark wool collar, the silver ivy leaf locket caught the pale, filtered afternoon light. It was no longer hidden beneath a scratchy, grease-stained apron. It was no longer a dangerous secret to be guarded in the terrified dark. It was finally simply hers. Alden Vane walked a few paces behind her, his heavy leather boots making almost no sound on the soft, mossy earth. He did not crowd her steps. He did not attempt to lead her through her own ancestral home or claim the moment for himself. He merely accompanied her, offering his immense power as a steady, quiet anchor. When she stopped near the center of the garden, where an ancient marble fountain lay cracked and covered in thick green moss, he halted as well, keeping a deeply respectful distance. Clara knelt carefully on the wet ground. The damp cold immediately seeped through the heavy fabric of her skirt, but she did not pull away. She reached out, pressing her bare fingers deep into the dark, loamy soil. The texture was rough, mixed with small, sharp pebbles and decaying pine needles. She dug her fingertips in, letting the wet earth pack tightly under her nails. This was the dirt her mother had walked on. This was the exact soil Eric Vane had traded his final, bleeding breaths to preserve. It felt heavy, cold, and undeniably real. The long decades of invisibility, of meticulously scrubbing hearths and keeping her head bowed in the cold shadows of someone else's fortress, slowly settled into the ground beneath her palms. "It will take time to clear the overgrowth," Alden said quietly, his low voice blending effortlessly with the rustle of the wind moving through the high cedar branches. "I have time," Clara answered. She did not turn around immediately, but she allowed the warmth of his proximity to wash over the chill in her bones. She stood up slowly, wiping the damp soil from her hands with a clean linen cloth from her pocket. She turned to face the Alpha King. His dark, observant eyes tracked the movement, lacking any trace of the systemic arrogance that usually infected men of his high rank. He looked at the dark mud clinging to her fingers, then up to the shining silver ivy leaf locket, and finally up to her face. He did not demand her gratitude, he only offered his absolute, unbroken respect. And for the first time in a very long life of hiding, Clara Finch looked back at the sovereign of the North, not as an overlooked servant waiting for permission to exist, but as an equal standing firmly on her own soil. The wind stirred the high branches, and the garden was perfectly, durably quiet.